Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to another one of our Mandate Heaven Yellow Turban reform guides. This is part 2, where we'll be covering the red and blue reforms. So previously, we talked about how beautiful the reform tree was in part 1 of our overview series, and now in part 2, we'll be taking a look at the red and blue trees, which are the first two trees in this reform setup. And in our part 1, we did do an overview over all 4 of these trees, and in that we covered that the red tree stands for infrastructure and economy, while the blue tree stands for philosophy and trade. So today, we'll just be doing a rundown of each of these trees in greater detail, as there are 23 reforms on the red tree and 19 reforms on the blue tree. So one of the biggest things we did in part 1 of the overview is we talked about how despite the artistic presentations of these trees, it made analysis of the reforms a lot more difficult because they didn't break it down by the 4 different tiers, because you have 4-term reforms, 6-term reforms, 10-term reforms, and 15-term reforms all mixed up in this tree, and it was kind of hard to tell which ones are your 6-term, which one are your 10 turns. The 15 ones are quite easy, they're at the end of the branch, and the 4-term ones are the ones at the start, but there is no clear boundary between the length of the branches. So instead, what I did is I redrew the trees in this chart, and it was much more clear once you put it down on paper this way to kind of see the branching and the breakdown of these reforms by the amount of turn that it took to research them individually. So here we have the infrastructure and economy tree, and then this is the philosophy and trade tree, which has a lot less reforms. But let's go over these one at a time, starting with the red one, infrastructure and economy. And we'll be taking a look at these by turns. So first, we'll look at the 4 reforms here that belongs to the 4-term reforms. And these are a new beginning, peacetime farm labor, knowledge of the people, propagation of the way. And these reforms are pretty simple reforms. You can kind of look at what they do. The entire theme of infrastructure and economy is actually building unlocks. You're going to get most of your level 4 and level 5 buildings unlocked from this tree. And given how the structure of the Yellow Turban setup is for Mandate Heaven, where you start out with the Mandate War, it's actually probably not an urgent tree to go after, because you're not going to be doing a lot of constructing and building your empire. You'll be more concerned with survival, because the Han Empire will declare war on you. And by Han Empire, I mean everyone on the map. So, while some factions, let's say Zhang Jiao's faction, does start out with a new beginning, where you get a nice 6k population growth per county, in throughout your whole faction per turn, which is really good actually, given the recent changes to population growth matching with income and replenishment. But if you're playing as another faction, you probably wouldn't even want to spend 4 turns researching this, just because you're not that concerned with how much money your commanderies are producing. You have a pretty set, simple template to go with your build, which we'll cover later on in a better commandery guide video. So these bonuses are rather minor in the grand scheme of things. 40% from peasantry for peacetime farm labor. I mean, even by the name, peacetime farm labor, when you're at war, you're not really going to be worried about this. Knowledge of the people, granting you 20% construction cost discount for the settlement upgrade, or basically changing from town to a large town to small city. This is not a bad bonus to get for only 4 turns. So there is some merit to coming after this, except for a few things we're going to talk about a bit later. The 4 turns that you see here is a little bit disillusional. It does cost you 4 turns to pick up this reform, but in the case of knowledge of the people, it's actually going to cost you 8 turns because you must research a new beginning first, because of the way the hierarchy system work even within the same turn reforms. So we're going to showcase that as well in a different presentation. Just wait a little bit longer. The last thing I do have to mention is that these enlightenment figures you see here, these are pretty much prestige for Yellow Turbans. So if you want to rank up your factions to get more army count, to get eventually some extra administrators, and extra replenishment bonus and other character related bonuses, you're going to need to acquire enlightenment in the same way you have to acquire prestige. And actually, reforms are the key way for Yellow Turbans to get the enlightenment they need to rank up. So by getting 10 enlightenment on propagation of the way versus, let's say, peacetime farm labor, it's actually quite worth it. So you have to consider the enlightenment aspect of these reforms as well as the bonuses that they provide. So these are the 4-turn reforms. Moving on, we have 6-turn reforms. There's quite a bit of these, so we're going to be presenting them in batches. The first batch here includes improved rural administration, 5 enlightenment, 25% building upkeep. Pretty bad reform. You're going to see that's going to be a trend with a lot of these reforms. They're just not very good. The gameplay of the Yellow Turban is actually very stripped down and simple. It's basically you're at war with everyone. There's no diplomacy. Your building options are pretty linear. There's not a lot of combos. You don't get a lot of percentages. So a lot of these bonuses don't really matter for you that much. And then the next up, we have simplified transactions. This gives you 15 enlightenment, which is great, and 20% income from industry, which is also pretty great. You also unlock a lot of different level 5 agricultural related upgrades. These include your county as well as your own buildings. So a lot of these are actually county upgrades, farmlands, and lumberyards, and so forth. Land conversion, also a 6-turn reform, 15% income to all sources. This is probably your best bonus you're going to see coming out of one of these 6-turn reforms from the red tree. 15% to all sources, always great. You also get level 4 upgrades to buildings, which makes more sense because if you don't get the level 4 ones, you can't even build the level 5 ones. So that includes some of the livestock farm and some of the regular land development buildings, or farming buildings, I think they're called for Yellow Turbans. So definitely a good one here for land conversion. Experienced farmer, completely pointless. You're not going to build super tall as Yellow Turbans, so 25% food production isn't going to do you much. All 3 of the Yellow Turban brothers in this start date of 182 starts in the north. Tons of food available. There's no reason to need more food. You can't really trade it away. So that's a bad reform. Shipwright, same logic. Fishing from fishing, which doesn't really impact you that much. The upgraded bonus buildings of harbor and trade port doesn't actually do much for you because if you look at the map, there's a few trade ports in the northeast. I think in particular there's one in Youbeiping, and there's a fishing port in Bohai. But that's pretty much it. You don't have that many harbor commanderies in the north. So just geographically speaking, these are definitely not urgent. And moving on to the second batch here, another 5 6-turn reforms. There's tons of 6-turn reforms for infrastructure and economy. So first up, we have perennial agriculture. Once again, it's a food boosting one. Same logic, not very good. Share Society has minus 25% cost for agriculture. This could be okay. And the buildings that unlock is the salt mine, silk, and spice traders. That really is not that good. There is one salt mine in the northern region where you start in Pingyuan. And aside from that, unless you somehow expand west or reach all the way down south, let's say you're playing a super long campaign where after you win the Mandate War, you keep playing till you get Emperor and all that, perhaps these will come in handy. But for most cases, these are quite useless early on, even into the mid game. You don't want to be spending your energy on these. Next up is Black Market. These are your level 4. I think this is a harbor building upgrade. There's 2 varieties. This is the other variety and some marketplace upgrades. Not very useful. Religious organization plus 3 public order. This is just a big burst of enlightenment if you needed it, but there's other options that provide better bonuses than public order. And next up, you have 20% commerce from self-sufficient communities and the level 4 school, which I don't even know why Yellow Turbans had the school building as an option to begin with. Anyhow, continue on to our 10-turn reforms. We have countryside control, 10 enlightenment, no bonuses, level 4 upgrades. I know this seems very counterintuitive that a level 5 upgrade would be linked to a 6-turn reform, but then the level 4 prerequisite are linked to 10-turn reform. This has a lot to do with where they are on the branches, because countryside control is one of these 10-turn reform that you can get relatively quickly if you look at the ordering, which we'll show a bit later. Organized farming, you have the level 5 upgrade to all the livestock farm, 20 enlightenment, pretty good deal. Citizens of the Yellow Sky, boost to silk and spice income, very useless. Order of the Ritualist, 20 enlightenment, minus 25% construction cost to military buildings, which includes your forge, and I don't even remember the other two, just I spam forge all the time, and it's not expensive. You don't really need 25% discount. I guess iron mine and such would also count, so horse pastures, but not really that important in the grand scheme of things. Centers of healing, nice 10% boost to commerce and industry, a little weaker than all income, but commerce industry is a very strong combo because one of the key buildings for Yellow Turbans early on is the communal inn plus the forge, so you always have some commerce and industry going around. And finally, we have our 15 turn reforms. There's only 4 of them here. These mostly provide level 5 building upgrades, and you get some 20 points of enlightenment from agricultural architecture, as well as a bunch of level 5 buildings. 15 points of enlightenment, minus 25% cost to mines. A bit late, if you ask me, for that upgrade to really matter, and the minus 2 turn construction time. Because if you think about the way these are structured, by the time you unlock this, you're about 50 turns into the game, even if you rush this. So don't really see how this is going to help you. You either are snowballing really well by 50 turn and you're destroying the High Empire, or you're already dead, because that's what's going to happen to you in the Mandate War. So these economic focus or civil focus trees are just very weak to consider in the early stages of the game. Only when you're going for long campaigns, perhaps that's when these will become important. Co-coordinated construction, 20 points of enlightenment, a bunch of nice level 5 building upgrades. Institutionalized Taoism, 2 extra assignments. So this is not bad technically, but as a 15 turn reform, it can't be that good. Assignments are strong for Yellow Turbans, but some of them are broken and currently not working in the game, needs to be patched. Like, you cannot actually use the assignment to get more characters. It doesn't work. If that one worked, then this is really good, because that assignment gives you a new general every 5 turns per assignment. So if you're able to have a bunch of city run this assignment at the same time, 2 extra assignment slot means 2 extra generals, and generals have faction-wide skills for Yellow Turbans, so that actually scales super well. As a Yellow Turban faction, you want to have as many generals as possible, so if these assignments actually work, getting 2 extra assignment is actually a very big deal. Now, we talked about how we have this chart, but if you just look at the way the branches work, you can see that, let's say, improve rural administration on the top, it links from a new beginning like the other 3 4-turn reforms, but here it's a 6-turn reform. So the amount of turns it takes to unlock a certain reform is the total turns of everything before it. So that's actually a better representation of each individual reform cost if you're looking at things. So I went ahead and I picked out every reform, and I added up every single reform needed to pick up that reform beforehand and provided the figures here. Now, obviously, because the way research rate works in the game, let's say you have 150% research rate. Then at that point, 4-turn reforms, if you divide 4 by 1.5, you get 2 point something. Because you get 2 point something, it's going to be a 3-turn reform. All right, you only save 1 turn, because even though you're technically saving like 1.8 turns, you can't research 0.2 turns of material. You have to waste a full turn to unlock it. So that means you're not efficiently saving when you're at 150% for 4-turn reforms. But because 6 is divisible by 1.5, right, goes to 4, you're actually super efficiently saving 2 turns from the 6-turn reform. So these figures could alter quite a bit depending on what your exact research rate is at various different times of the game. But generally, if you're staying at 100%, this is the figure you're looking at. And you can see, for example, shipwright and countryside control, which we talked about earlier, being countryside control providing these level 4 building upgrades, even though it itself is a 10-turn reform. And by the way, these are color-coded by what the individual reform cost is. So countryside control costs 10 turns, that's why it has the orange shade. which is what we used earlier for the previous chart. And the blue shade is for all the 6-turn reforms, and the green shade is all for the 4-turn reforms, and so forth. So you can tell pretty easily that the red reforms down here, the red shade ones, the last 4, the 15-turn reforms, they're going to take a while. 39 turns is a long time for the Mandate of Heaven DLC. So that's kind of where you're looking at, and you can kind of see which ones are more efficient and kind of gear your playstyle towards them. So that's it for infrastructure and economy. Moving on to philosophy and trade, a little bit simpler setup, nice deep branches at the bottom, lots of 10-turn reforms. So let's quickly jump in here with just the 2 4-turn reforms. Existential Schism, which is pretty simple. It's the first reform you need to unlock in this tree, 10% to character experience. Pretty helpful. You can level up, get more skills. Yellow Turban skills are very powerful, so you can definitely invest in this early on. This tree also has something else special going on for it. We'll talk about that in the end. Building Connections is the other 4-turn reform. You get 2 available administrator position, which is really an inconsistent typo here. This should really say 2 available local leaders, because that's what Yellow Turban administrators are called. I called out on CA on this when they had the preview build for the beta build, but they still haven't fixed it, along with a lot of things in Mandate of Heaven. So moving on to 6-turn reforms, we have Indoctrination, +1 starting rank for all recruit. Pretty good. And then you get these 3 different ones: Confession of Sin, Practice of the Art of the Great Peace, Library of Heavenly Work. That gives flat 10-point enlightenment and 6-point satisfaction for scholars, 6-point satisfaction for healers, 6-point satisfaction for healers. So 2 healers. But what is really going on here is, if you're playing on Legendary, sure, you'll have some issues with satisfaction, especially if you field a large roster of generals and you're not using them. But if you build communal inns, each one of them, you can automatically upgrade them to level 3 without any reforms. If you just have 2 cities dedicated to that, that's your 6-point satisfaction for all classes. So you don't really need these. So I don't really see a benefit to these in the early game. There's really no reason to go for it. And if you're going to go for one of these, depending on the structure of the tree, obviously, but clearly Library of the Heavenly Work is the one you want to get, because you're using the same amount of turns to pick up something that gives you 15 points in enlightenment with the same value to healers, which is Practice of the Art of Great Peace, which completely is trashed here if you compare it straight to Library of Heavenly Works. So moving on to 10-turn reforms, this is the big bulk of things, so we're doing these in batches again. Enlightenment, as the title suggests, a lot of enlightenment, 20 points right here, minus 10% corruption, helpful, but not needed, because you're not really going to run a huge empire early on, so don't see why you will rush this. Reserve capacity, also not needed. Communal activities is kind of interesting. You have the correct name of local leader here, +2 available, and also 6 points of satisfaction for veterans and 15 points of enlightenment. Pretty strong overall, because administrators or local leaders are still very powerful in the game. Places of worship, another 6 points for scholars. And then you have Rallying Speech, which gives you a level 4 building upgrade. I think this is one of the agricultural ones. And then there's a minus 25% character salary on Representation of Heaven. This is really not needed. Yellow Turban characters starts out very weird. At lower ranks, they don't have a title system. They're free. They're basically volunteers. Once they rank up and get those improved armor, they're moving up from pupil to student all the way to Sient, they're going to cost you more and more money. The salary discount will slowly disappear. So you're never really at a cash crunch for characters. So this 25% character salary, while really good if you're playing a Han faction, is actually not that useful for Yellow Turbans. So we can move on to the second batch here. We have another level 4. This is a granary building, another agricultural building requirement. 20 points of enlightenment, command of the elements, useless. The Way of the Celestial Masters, flat 10 points of satisfaction to all characters. This is also kind of counterintuitive in a sense, because as you get these reform, you're getting that enlightenment build up and you're getting that rank up. And when you rank up twice as Yellow Turbans, you pick up a trait called all characters do not have desire for higher office. So at that point, satisfaction is done. You don't actually need to worry about satisfaction ever again. It's not like someone can turncoat your Yellow Turban generals. It's not like someone can send a spy to your faction. So there's absolutely no reason to try to raise satisfaction to 100 like you would with Han factions. So stuff like this, quite useless. Missionaries, 20 points in Enlightenment, very good. 2 available trade route, very questionable, because you can't trade with many people as Yellow Turbans. If your brothers, Zhang Jiao, Zhang Bao, Zhang Liang, doesn't matter who you play, or let's say if you manage to border Huang Shao's faction, perhaps, he's the only one that's really close enough to actually border you, and you can trade with them, they have to also pick up stuff like the missionary reform here. Because if they don't have this reform, they only have their one trade route, which they definitely would be trading with someone immediately, which means you have 2 extra trade route and no partners. So not as beneficial as you would think. Same logic, organization of the people, 25% trade influence, not really going to matter if you can only have 1 or 2 trade routes. So moving on, we have the 15-turn reform. Here's where things get a little special for philosophy and trade. You have dedication to the land, Great Peace Taoist, and Adobe of the Heavenly Masters. These 3 not only gives you 3 buildings, they also unlock you 3 court positions. The General of the People, General of the Heaven, General of the Land come from these 3 reforms. So in a sense, if you want to have a faction-wide boost to different income sources, as well as other faction-wide bonuses by having these 3 positions filled, because they're considered like your prime minister role or heir role. So if you give them items that are faction-wide, it will activate. If you don't unlock these reforms, you'll never get those positions. And if you never get those positions, your leader will be the only one whose item and bonuses grant faction-wide bonuses. So in a sense, you might be incentivized to go through the philosophy and trade tree if you're considering playing a longer Yellow Turban campaign where you go beyond the mandate wars, because then you might want to have a more fleshed out court that can help boost a lot of things for your faction. Lastly, you have Heavenly Governance on the side, plus 10 points of diplomatic relations with all factions, even though the game is preset to always be at war between the Han subculture and Yellow Turban. So you can't actually take advantage of this unless you want to be super friendly with your brothers, but that's pretty much the only benefit this brings. So once again, back to the tree. It's pretty clear and pretty great way to look at the branches, but we're also going to switch them to the method where we count the total number of turns it takes to reach these individual reforms, and they're color-coded by the same logic. And you can see at the very bottom, to reach those unlocks for those 3 key positions, it's going to take you 49 turns, even if you rush for it. So not something you should consider right away. The benefit is pretty high, but the cost is pretty high as well. So definitely balance that one out. And you can note that one of them is out of order. Heavenly Grace only takes 33 turns because the way it's structured on the tree. But I put it on the side as the red because the color code works better that way. But you can see Rallying Speech, Command of the Elements, and Missionaries, because they have these double stacked 10-turn reforms, actually end up costing more time than a 15-turn reform. So you don't always consider what each individual reform costs, but where they are on the tree and kind of look at their value. Now you might think the 2 parts that we covered today, the infrastructure economy and the philosophy and trade, garbage reforms all over the place. And indeed, that's true. That's just the way the 182 Yellow Turbans are set up. You're at war. So in our next part, part 3, when we talk about the last 2 trees, the yellow and the pink tree, we will be looking at more military focused reform, and those are going to be much more valuable to your faction. So hopefully you enjoy this one and you'll come back for that one. See you guys then. Bye.